All righty. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual learning course, 5 Techniques for Delivering Winning Virtual Shortlist Presentations. My name is Sarah Snavely with Timmons Group, and I will be moderating today's session. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This program will be provided via both audio and web conference and will last approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. If you have questions at any point during today's presentation, you may submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please note that this presentation is worth 1 AIA LU credit. Certificates of completion and credit submission will be done upon request. Should you require either of those, please reach out to us after the presentation. The contact information will be listed on the last slide of today's presentation. Now, on to the good stuff. Shortlist presentations are the make it or break it phase of any pursuit. It's the moment when your team can connect with decision makers, demonstrate expertise, and communicate approach to solving client issues, as well as developing rapport. Driving these points is enough to induce stress in even the most seasoned technical professional. In this new normal, communicating these points is simply not enough. To win, teams participating in virtual shortlist presentations must deliver in new, more choreographed ways. Today, we will dive into 5 techniques that will help teams deliver in delivering a winning and fully virtual shortlist presentation. Now, here's a clue. Just using the same approach as you would for an in-person presentation will not deliver a win. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Tim Klabunde and Sylvia Montgomery with Timmons Group. Go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And I got to say, the introduction calling us the good stuff. Sylvia, I'm feeling pretty good about this already.
I'm feeling good about it.
Okay, I'll take it. So probably like a lot of you on the call today, I went into my first interview in 2001. It was a good experience. Walked in probably about 10 minutes early to set up my projector, get all the cables and things that we used to use heavily back in those days set up, introduced myself to the panel, shook hands as we were setting things up, went into a fairly formal structured presentation. And at the end of the presentation, we sat down and as we were sitting down and getting up and just different things, we were talking, interacting, connecting across the table, connecting as we walked to the door. It was one of those experiences where you just get to have a great relationship and you start really kicking things off and connecting with a client. I'm lucky in that my first interview I was ever in, we won. I've lost my fair share along the way as well, but that particular one, thanks Sylvia, we definitely won. And I realized afterwards that it was really the time that we spent after the interview had ended that was the reason that we won the interview. In other words, it was the 20 minutes that we spent talking about any given different thing, I was talking about cars earlier, talking about different pieces that we connected with that really brought that interview home. Well, what we're going to talk about today is really about that piece of how do we make certain that we're still winning these interviews with the advent of them being virtual interviews. I'll say the biggest thing that we struggle with in virtual interviews is that they heavily favor the incumbent. So if you're walking in as the incumbent, that's a good thing. If you are trying to break in from the outside, it's much more difficult to break in underneath a virtual interview. It's almost that unfair advantage that starts being given to the company because you're having a hard time in a virtual context creating and engaging in that relationship. So first off, what we're not going to talk about today is we're not going to sit here and talk about all of the different pieces and parts. You guys, we're expecting that a lot of you have done interviews before. Instead, what we're going to talk about is what makes a virtual interview different and what you can do to make certain that you're succeeding inside that virtual interview. As for myself, Timmons Group, Timmons Group has been actually doing virtual interviews for over a decade now as a result of one of our business lines. It was nothing that we purposely did. We didn't purposely set out to go start doing virtual interviews. We've just, because of that business line, had to do it for over 10 years now. Sylvia, likewise, has not only trained and taught others how to deal with interviews and how to connect with other people, but she's also done the vast majority of the interviews that she's sat in were virtual interviews. As many of you know, Sylvia was actually one of the founders of Hinge and Hinge Consulting. So, take that together. Basically, Sylvia and I wanted to just take a little bit and share with you some of the things that she and I have learned along the way. I'd hate to say through the School of Hard Knocks, but the vast majority of this is probably through the School of Hard Knocks, just to be able to share those things with you so you guys can be as successful as possible as we're charting into new territory for many firms.
You're right, Tim. It's really interesting because, I was at Hinge for about 10 years, and the practice, my AEC practice, was built really online. About 90% of my clients when I was there were clients national, scattered all over the country. So it was always a treat to be able to go to someone's office, but it was really not the norm. And, everything went against conventional wisdom, because people would say, oh no, you have to go see the client. And particularly in this industry, you have to show up, you have to shake their hand. And now looking back into it, there were invaluable lessons, some of them not so hot, but all in all, it was a really good experience, and one that really is translating to where we are today. So really where we're going to spend our time today is we're going to, technology is the vehicle for all this. So we have to acknowledge it. We're going to spend a little bit of time towards the end talking about some of those technology specific things. But, we're going to focus on getting the success that comes with the delivery of the actual presentation. So the technology is going to be the vehicle, but it's in that delivery that's really going to bring out the success. And we're going to look into getting into that virtual mindset. How does everybody get into that mindset? We all know what we normally do when we're in person and when we're preparing for an in-person presentation. But how do we get into that virtual mindset? How do we create the rapport? How do we engage the audience? We're going to give you some tips and tricks to engaging your online audience. How do you balance that face-to-face time with some actual slides? And then we're going to go to the technology. So the format for today is very much like you're seeing now. Tim and I are going to have a dialogue, and at different times we're going to bring up a slide, and that's going to kind of recap what we've talked a little bit of. And along the way, we're going to be showing you what we mean and what we hope you do for your own presentation without actually telling you this is what you'll do, but you'll see it in action. So, today we're really excited about kind of going through these things. And as Sarah said, at the end, we're going to do a Q&A, and the slides will be available upon request. So let's dive into it.
I'm realizing something as I'm sitting here is that I'm going to be sharing a couple of stories as we go through this, and fact checking is probably crazy busy here because everyone's sitting at their computers right now. So I'm going to have to make certain I get my statistics dead on the money. Well, that said, I actually, there's a gentleman that I am a follower of and a fan of. His name is Scott Ginsing, sorry. Scott is an expert on approachability, and I want to share a little bit of his story with you right now, just to relate it to virtual interviews and to meetings virtually in general. So Scott has a very interesting story because in a psychology program in college, Scott basically was given an assignment to wear a name tag for 3 days. Pretty straightforward psychology experiment. They wanted to see what were the reactions and what happened if someone wore a name tag for 3 days. So he slapped his name tag on, walked out in his dorm room one morning, and was going to wear that for 3 days. And it was interesting what happened over the course of the 3 days. People would just walk up to him out of the blue, say hi to him, connect with him. Basically, he said as long as he has that name tag on, everybody felt like they could just walk up to him at random and check on him. And, it was, you look at his story, and on day 4, he made a unique choice. One choice, in my opinion, that has changed the rest of his life and he'd agree with, is he chose not to take the name tag off. As we sit here today, this is my stat, I gotta make sure I got it right, is as we sit here today, Scott has been wearing a name tag for 7,111 days. 7,100.
That's pretty
Exactly.
impressive.
Yeah, you know, and here's the things he learned. Well, first off, he tells you he learns two things. One is that on a college campus, you can't get a date while wearing a name tag. That's probably irrelevant to our conversation today. But the second thing that he learned was that name tags aren't about you. They're about the person you're meeting with. They're about that person that you're talking to.
Makes sense.
So what we're going to kind of hit on here today is cameras are the exact same thing. If we want to be approachable in a virtual training situation, your camera has to be on. Note that Sylvia and I right now are not hiding behind a PowerPoint presentation. You get to kind of see us as we're flipping back and forth. You will see parts of a presentation as we go through. But the key here is that if you want to be approachable and in a relationship, which we already know relationships are what's going to win the interview. If you want to be in that, it's relationships and other things as well. But you know, if you want to be in that relationship, you've got to make certain those cameras are on. Second thing is making certain you're animated. Sylvia and I are not going to have a problem with this today because we both use our hands to talk. So this isn't I don't think this is going to be an issue for you and I, Sylvia.
No, I don't think so.
No, but I do think that with a lot of the engineers I've trained over the years and the technical staff is that making certain that we're not just kind of structured and sit and kind of stagnant. It's really important we're on a camera because it's all about relationships. I will say one other piece, you know, in addition to camera is that your microphone matters in a shortlist interview, and Sylvia is going to go into details later about how, you know, the technical aspects of the interview. But one thing I do want to say is that making certain that your microphone is set up in such a way that it's a real you and a real version of you, making certain that your voice isn't muted, that you're not sitting in the, you know, it sounds like you're sitting across the room or something like that. These are all some really important things. Likewise, she's going to talk about some of those details of it, but the other side to this is that, remember, this is technology, so we can cheat when we're in an interview in ways that we normally can't cheat in an interview. Scott Wiley, he's one of our landscape architects in the office I'm sitting in. Actually, each of us is in a different office across the East Coast right now.
Three of us, for that matter.
Yes. And as we're sitting here, I'm sorry, Scott, basically landscape architect in our Richmond, Virginia office. Scott we've actually been doing a lot of video recording and using that for marketing purposes. So Scott walked out on site and he was talking about a site. And as he was recording himself with his audio, he had actually downloaded an app for his iPhone, which we use for most of our video recording. And on his screen was a teleprompter. Nobody had a clue that the guy was running a teleprompter for a rather long version of talking. Well, right now, as I'm sitting here talking to you, not the previous part and not after this, but I'm sitting and just reading text at the top of my screen. In other words, I can actually use the information and the technology around me as a method and as a way to cheat the system. So when you're dealing with as a project manager or younger staff especially, remember technology, this isn't just a detriment. This is also a positive that we can take advantage of as long as we're using the technology to win the presentation. And, you know, that is really the key to what we're doing, is talking about using the technology to win the presentation. And as I'm kind of wrapping up our first point here, you'll note that I'm pulling up a PowerPoint slide specifically talking about the things that we're talking about. You should still see me in the top right-hand corner, but you know, we're talking about, as I look at this slide, you'll see there's only about 90 seconds it's going to take for any audience to absorb a slide. And in those 90 seconds, we want to make certain that information is here as a way to reinforce it. Note cameras have been on this entire time. I already talked about that. You know, using images that support your story. And remember, making certain that you're taking advantage of those cheating situations. So the slide that we're using right now is a reinforcing mechanism on the actual presentation as we're coming back into it, as we sit right now, into more of a relationship mindset.
Exactly. And, you know, we have that the technology helps us create that virtual mindset, but, you know, it's really about creating the rapport, and that goes without saying. So it's very different than if we were all in the room. You know, just reflect back to the few minutes before we actually started the presentation. What were we doing? We were just chatting. You know, we're talking
Yeah,
about our
about
dogs.
we were not just chatting. That was bourbon. That was, you know, I think we had more comments on that than we might have more questions about bourbon than we have about the entire presentation when we get to the end.
Absolutely possible. So we talked about bourbon, we talked about the dogs, we talked about drinking at work, you know, and these are all things that in our own way, we were creating that rapport with folks in the room, and we started to get chats from people. So that was mimicking what you would normally be doing if everybody was in the same room, but we can't be in the same room. So again, it's a very subliminal thing. We don't say, and now we're going to chat, but you know, it's happening, and people, the tendency is for people to jump in. You know, but let's talk a little bit about learning as much as possible about the audience that you're going to be speaking to. Under normal circumstances, you have a shortlist presentation, and we know that folks are going to try to research as much as possible about the selection committee that they're going to be meeting with. So goes without saying, virtually, you want to do the same, but also look for other cues. You know, for example, right here, you see a little postcard that I have with Minnie Mouse. So if you were presenting to me and you saw that, that would be a fabulous opportunity for you to say, hey, Sylvia, when was the last time you went to Disney World? And I jump into a conversation and I tell you all about my last trip, which was to celebrate my granddaughter's 4th birthday, her leap day birthday.
Oh, that's awesome. I like
this
that
year.
one.
Exactly. But that just creates another level, another opportunity for you to create a rapport with a person. So we are left with looking for clues in the person's background. You know, Tim has his cars. I know he's going to talk about his cars.
I can put my screen up just so you can see that as we're talking over here.
Well, exactly. And I know he's going to talk about it in a little bit, but that's, again, looking for cues in the person's background. There is, you know, something that we've already encountered. There have been instances where the selection committee does not have its video on. And that could be very traumatic, if you will, if you're going into a presentation and the video is on. So you have to remember that even though you don't have the video, you still want to employ some tactics, which we're going to be sprinkling along the presentation on how to develop that rapport. And go ahead.
And remember, just as we were just now talking at the beginning, we still have that 5-minute introduction where we were talking, I didn't mean bourbon to be the topic, by the way, but we got so much interaction on that. Those are still those things that we can do, even if their backgrounds are turned off.
Exactly. And, you know, going back to pre-presentation, you want to mimic the setup that you're going to have, as, you know, to mimic that of the audience you're presenting to. So for example, if the selection committee is going to have 5 individuals present with video or without, and they're each working from home, then it's appropriate for you to mimic that. You want to have 5 individuals presenting. Ideally, they'll also be working from home, but if somebody's in the office, again, maintaining that social distancing, because you want to mimic what your potential client is doing. You want to be respectful of that. And you want to look directly at the camera at all times. You know, it may feel a little bit weird because you're just not, the tendency is to want to look at the person on the camera or on the, you know, the actual Zoom box, but you want to be speaking directly at the camera and you want to make that visual connection with them. Today, the way, because we're running this as a webinar, it is a little bit limiting. If we were in a meeting setup, then people would be able to jump in and out and have a dialogue. But as a webinar, we are using the chat feature. Another thing to keep in mind when developing that rapport and creating that rapport is that people learn in different ways. You know, some people learn by listening and hearing an animated voice, a voice with fluctuations, a voice where you emphasize certain things. They're going to have a recall that's very different than people that like to see things. That's why you don't just see Tim and myself talking, but you're actually going to see a slide that recaps what we're saying. So we've talked about the listening and the seeing mode, but there's another set of people that like to learn by participating and by engaging in what's actually happening. So keep that in mind when you're presenting. You know, you might use something, you know, as simple as, you know, folks, we know that you have your own, you know, criteria worksheet that you'll be working on, but during this presentation, we encourage you to take some notes. And if it's anything in particular that you may have a question about, you can even have something as simple as the Ben Franklin checklist, which is when you have a plus and a minus and you draw a line down the middle. And as we're talking about things, you can write your own notes, and hopefully there will not be anything in that minus category. But again, you want to make sure that out of the onset, you are making allowances to facilitate the learning in all three ways. And finally, when it comes to creating rapport, I just have to mention that don't apologize. Everybody knows why we're doing this remotely. So there's no need to go there. And if you go there at the onset, it just kind of puts this doubt of, oh, maybe these people don't feel so comfortable doing it this way. And if we're stuck in this mode for a while, are they going to be able to handle it? So those are just some things when it comes to creating the rapport to keep in mind. So let's look at our checklist here. We've talked about how human can you be? How much can you do to show them that you're engaged? And sometimes it does feel like you're being a little bit over animated, but that's okay because you want it to translate. Research your audience and connect in as many ways possible, whether it's something in their background that's visible or something that you've learned from them, through your research. Don't mumble. What we don't want is somebody to kind of just start talking and then just kind of drift off and you can't hear it. Exactly. So again, be very clear, enunciate, look into your camera, and just relax and enjoy yourself and smile.
I want to see you do that that drift off thing again here. No, I'll spare you. There's a gentleman at our office. His name is Drew Gold. He actually heads up one of our public land division here. And Drew, I've been in a lot of meetings with Drew in the last 5 weeks, especially that are virtual meetings. And it has been really interesting to sit and watch those meetings unfold. This is something that a lot of you have probably experienced as as people are muting, unmuting, jumping in and giving their comments. And Drew is he's actually one of the more patient people you'll ever meet. And as we're looking at different things and talking, one of the things I've learned with Drew is that I'm actually keeping my eye on his screen and on him in the Zoom meeting regularly for one little important key, which is I'm looking to see if Drew is going to unmute, because without fail, when Drew unmutes, it means there's something on his mind. And if I keep talking, I'm going to talk right over whatever it is on his mind. And I got to tell you, this is a little technique. Unfortunately, Drew's probably going to watch this. So that I lost my technique with Drew.
We just lost it.
Well, I'll come up with something else for him. But, the idea here is when you're doing an interview, especially, keep an eye out for those, for things like that are those hints. If you can see someone in the screen, obviously you're looking for that I want to talk type of persona. If you have people muting and unmuting, keep an eye out for the mute coming off. And it's really easy just to ask a question of, hey, John, it looked like you had something you wanted to add or a question you might have to ask. It doesn't, you don't need to call out that I just saw you turn off your unmute. Instead, it's just hey, it looks like you were asking that. And remember, or had a question. And remember, that's something that you can do even if their camera's not on. You can still make that recognition by watching that mute come off. It's going to show how interested you are in your client. Now, I'll tell you a little secret. The actual slide that we're talking about right now has nothing to do with muting and unmuting. It's actually about transitions. Namely, it's about active transitions. So as Sylvia and I went from point to point, she didn't just now end what she said with, and now I'm done with point number 2, and I would like to have Tim talk about this. We didn't do, that's called an active handshake, by the way. We didn't do a handshake. And I gotta tell you, most of the time when you're interviewing in person, my hope is anyways, that you're not doing those types of handshakes. Instead, what we're doing is we are taking advantage of the pause. And the pause is an extraordinarily important part of virtual interviews, virtual presentations, and it's that idea that we're giving that moment for someone else to jump in. And that's very important when we're looking to engage with our audience and we're looking to connect with them back and forth, is we want to have that virtual pause built in. And so when Sylvia finished talking, all she did was pause. Now, Sylvia and I have been through this presentation. We obviously knew where she was going to drop off, where I was going to pick up. But it was very easy for us to flow in. And is all you heard me do was talk a story about Drew Gold in her office. Well, by the way, that story on watching mute and unmute is equally important, but the big key here is making certain that you're working on your active transitions,
Exactly.
because it looks more relational.
Yeah, it does.
So as we're focused on those relational aspects to it, now all of a sudden we're making it also open for our clients to engage. So Sylvia and I are going back and forth. Partially, we know where we're going to go back and forth for some degree or another, as you will, because you're going to be practicing in advance. That's for the normal presentation training. But but as you're doing that, it gives your client the opportunity to jump in and know that it's okay to jump in and jump back and forth on each of these topics. I guess I'll give one more piece to this is if you're working with a younger engineer, a younger architect, a younger superintendent, or anything of the sort, do know, just as you do with someone 5 years out of school in a regular interview, you can use the handicaps of saying, and now Sylvia is going to talk to you about this, if that's a need and if that's necessary for the actual conversation that's happening. So to kind of recap on technique number 3 here, it's making certain that you're creating the pause and looking for the pause. Look for the unmute, or let's be clear, that's just about body language as well. And the whole focus of this, the entire goal is on making it relational. There's this overall question, actually, Sylvia, you're the one that taught me this question. It's this idea of, I want to work with them. It's the idea of, how do we create an environment where I'm talking to somebody and they're just the person that I know I could see myself working with on a large project that might last several years.
Exactly. And that people want to work with people they like. That's just the bottom line. You want to have people that have the capabilities, that have the experience, but at the end of the day, you want to work with people that, like you said in the beginning, you can see yourselves going out, having a cup of coffee, having a drink, whatever, but you want to work with them. So being relational goes a long way into fostering, that rapport. But how do you also foster engagement throughout the presentation? We talked a little bit about that, encouraging them to take notes, but we want to bring that, you saw that also a little bit in our banter in the beginning. Again, not related to the presentation, but it was just a way to foster engagement. So you have to really think about all of these ways where you can do that in a natural and relational way. A couple of other things to look at is look at our backgrounds. Our backgrounds are very clean, uncluttered. They say a little bit about ourselves. And that helps, again, with fostering that engagement. But what we're not using is we're not using virtual backgrounds. Why? A couple of reasons. They do tend to look less professional, depending on how your speed is looking, your internet connection, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. The pixels tend to break off. So you kind of see this jaggedy movement and the background actually breaks up. So we don't recommend that you use virtual backgrounds. You also want to keep in mind, what are you wearing? What does the person on the other side see from you? If you want to sit up straight, look at the camera. If you wear a logoed shirt like I am, hopefully they'll see part of that, unless you're really short, and that doesn't work out as well. But you want to be mindful of all of these things. You also want to pace yourself. Again, people are now getting accustomed to this new medium, and it may take them a little bit longer to just connect or dial into the information. So you want to pace yourself. You want to speak clearly. I heard recently somebody had a shortlist presentation. They had 70 minutes. They had 110 slides. Now, rule of thumb says that you want to spend at least a minute, not more, obviously less is good, on a slide. Well, what do you think is going to happen when you're faced with 110 slides in 70 minutes? Somebody's going to be talking really fast, and more than likely, some of the folks on the receiving end are just going to be dozing off because it's not interesting. It's just slide after slide after slide. And I think yesterday, during our practice, you made a great point, Tim. That means that those people are not engaging with you.
Yep.
They're just kind of like, watching these slides go by, and you want to have those pauses. Even to the extent that you're using the pause to say something like, Renee, we've included some references to our landscape architecture on similar projects because we know that's an area of concern, or we know that's an area of particular interest. You don't want to use a negative, but a particular interest. So what I'm doing there is I'm saying to Renee, who's in the selection committee, hey, I know from previous meetings that this is important to you, and we're talking about it here. And maybe if Renee was falling asleep, which we hope she wasn't, she's just perked up. But again, you're just fostering that engagement. You want people to get the feeling that, hey, these folks in front of me, they know what they're talking about. They're the experts, and they're really, really interested in doing this. Another thing, go ahead, Tim.
Actually, that this is probably one of those areas that is the most important part to the virtual interview. It's the idea of how do we get back and forth so that the engagement is happening back and forth. In the old days, 6 weeks ago, you would put a set of plans in the middle of a table, and you'd suddenly have a client who was all engaged, interested in what was happening on those plans, be that construction side, engineering, or architecture side, anywhere inside the industry. You could really set down a set of plans and get people interested in them. This is how do you do that virtually, and that's why this technique is so important.
Exactly. So for those of you that have kids, or you've been in performances, that the more you practice, the more effortless it looks. It looks like you're just a natural. So how do you get there? You practice a lot. And basically, we want to be relational. We want to engage our audience. And the more we're going to be able to do that, the better. But the way you're going to be doing that is by having practiced and making it look effortless. Another tip, is that typically you want the project manager, the presumptive project manager, to be front and center in the presentation. You want them to be either kicking things off or kind of pass directing to different people, but you want to make sure that the selection committee connects with them. Well, what happens in a setting like this? It's very difficult to man questions and present. Not impossible, but it's very difficult. So who's that designee going to be? And we're going to share a little bit about who's our behind the scenes person in a little bit, but having that predetermination of who's fielding questions, who is actually gathering the questions, and the most important thing of this entire presentation when you're done presenting is to have a strong closing. You want to, again, look that prospect in the eye, and you want to say, we're very, very excited, and we really, really want to work with you guys. So ask for the work, have a strong closing, because that's really, that final opportunity for you to connect. So when it comes to technique number 4, ask the questions of your audience, draw them in, focus on the video, predetermine who's going to field the questions, because you're going to get questions. Ensure that your background is not distracting, and have a strong closing.
One of my favorite companies when it relates to marketing is a company called Blend Tech. I will say Blend Tech, part of the reason they're such one of my favorite companies is because of something they tripped into. So first off, let me tell you who Blend Tech is, and then I can give you some of the other information about it. But Blend Tech is a blender company, but don't think about you typically wouldn't think of them as a home blender. You would think of them as, I have a bunch of chemicals that are really difficult to mix together, and I need to blend those chemicals together. Or in another site, at a industrial food manufacturing place where you needed to really blend something together. And Blend Tech, about 12 years ago, was trying to start their first consumer line. Now, the problem that they had starting their first consumer line was very few people wanted to pay $400 for a blender, and that's what their blenders are. And they knew they had a great product, but they really couldn't figure out, how do we make certain that everyone else knows we have such a great product? And their marketing person was actually walking down the hall one day and saw the CEO of Blend Tech doing something that he often did when he was excessively frustrated, which was he would just blend things. And when I say blend things, he would blend some really strange things in blenders. Like he would take a hockey stick and he would start going down with a hockey stick to actually blend a hockey stick. By the way, this is why you pay $400 for the blender. And as they started getting into this, they started getting to a point where they found their secret in being able to produce some videos. I'm going to show one of them to you right now.
Will it blend? That is the question. I love my new iPhone. It does everything. But will it blend? That is the question. Let's find out. I think I'm going to push the smoothie button. I smoke. Don't breathe this.
So the day that you might have been one of the many thousands of people standing in line at an iPhone store, waiting patiently, if you recall back 12 years ago, there were lines around the block every single time a new iPhone was released. Blendtec decided what's better to do with a brand new iPhone except for to toss it in a blender. And an interesting thing happened, exactly what you would think would happen, is this video went viral. As, by the way, if you're bored this afternoon, there's probably another 100 videos of some really crazy stuff getting blended. I think there's rakes, hockey sticks, hockey pucks. There's everything you can possibly imagine that gets blended by this company. And all of a sudden, they had a product that was worth $400. They solved their problem by sharing their story. And that really is the key right now, is that this is about sharing your story. And as we talk about this, well, visuals become a real big key to sharing that story. You know, it's been fun sitting back and forth with Sylvia. Hopefully you're getting to know a little bit about us. You know, Sylvia, you commented on the cars earlier, which has a whole story behind it. You know, my kids' pictures over my shoulder. You're getting to know us, right? You're getting to meet us. It's not just a PowerPoint presentation sitting up, but we have to inject those videos and those things as well. So Blendtec, I love their story because, well, quite frankly, they made a name for themselves. Several of you probably have blenders, probably not all of you because they're $400 blenders still. But it's that visual that shares the story and tells the story. It's what's going to make the impact with your graphics that really matters. You know, some of this stuff is just related back to regular presentations. Have an uncluttered slide. Make certain that you don't have a tremendous amount of copy in there. But really, I want to tell you one of the biggest secrets, okay, if there was anything under this particular point you need to learn, is what you need is a Sarah. So this presentation is actually being run by Sarah. You haven't seen me typing responses to any of the chats, any of the questions that have been popping up, because we have this amazing thing called the Sarah that is behind the scenes working everything. Sarah, don't let your ego get too big on this thing, okay? Oh, you're muted, so we couldn't hit you.
I owe you $20. Never would I ever let that happen.
Oh, we have a bet, by the way, just the $20 reference is if you're walking into an interview, everybody has to put $20 on the table, and the first person that does not unmute when they're supposed to unmute owes everybody else the $20. Basically, it's a way to keep people from the proverbial I forgot to unmute situation in an interview. It was kind of a fun little game we play. Thank you, Sarah. I'm looking forward to my $20. But you need a Sarah, because as we're sitting here talking, Sarah is running the behind the scenes of what's going on. Now, we used to do this, by the way. Sylvia, you remember this, 2000, we would have someone in the room with us?
Yes.
And it would be some marketing person oftentimes, or an admin or someone who would walk into the interview room and not say a word, but they'd make sure the projector was running, the PowerPoint was running, because that was the new technology back then. Fast forward to today, you guys actually haven't seen Sarah except for when we have wanted to have her drop into the presentation. And that's a really neat thing that we're able to do to take advantage again of the technology. So make certain you're using that FaceTime, but have strong visuals, and those videos, those site plans, those strong images that really reinforce your message and reinforce the story that you're working to share.
Exactly. So now, we get to that part where the technology is the necessary evil. And, we want to really, kind of share this slide, and you can actually even print it and use it as a reminder moving forward. Just kind of keep it really accessible. But what's your setup? What's your dry run? Again, we've touched on the background, the attire, the sound. Having good sound is important. Last week, we were doing a practice and I was over Wi-Fi and it was breaking up, so Wi-Fi, it's a lot more unreliable. I now have a 100-foot cable running through my living room. So I am wired to the router.
That's what you always wanted, a 100-foot cable running down the smack dab center of your house. It's awesome.
Blue tape, and duct tape everywhere. But you wanna consider all of these things as you practice. Practice as you would on the day of. So again, practice as you would on the day of. That even includes practicing with the video off, because you don't know what's actually going to happen when you walk in that virtual room. It goes without saying that the folks that are not speaking at a particular moment in the presentation should continue to be engaged. So when you're practicing, practice being engaged, the nods, the commentary, but you don't just want to kind of be sitting on the sidelines. We want to consider what's the cloud platform that's being used. We're using Zoom today. A lot of people are very comfortable with Zoom now, but not every presentation is on Zoom. So there's going to be different requirements that come with each presentation in different ways that the person on the other end is identified. With Zoom, you get to see the person's name. That's great. But is that happening with all of the other technologies? You want to confirm what your suspicions are. You also want to confirm what the expectations of your audience are, and if there's any leeway into what you can send to them ahead of time as pre-event material. So can you send to them a placemat that has all of the presenters' pictures and some space for them to take notes? Obviously, that assumes that on their end, they're going to print that. So you'd want to see, is this something that works for them? Is this something that will help them? Are there any other materials that they're expecting you to send? You want to get all of those things identified prior to the day of. You want to make sure that, just like we did when we were just, bantering back and forth, we logged in at least 15 minutes prior. So we knew that the technology was working on the day of. Just because you've practiced yesterday and everything was working, you want to make sure that everything's working on the day of. You've noticed that we have not gotten any calls. There's been no pop-up boxes. That's because we turned everything off also. So everyone in your presentation, close Outlook, close your messengers, put your phones on mute, anything that can be distracting. And that goes as well for the participants in the presentation. When someone is not speaking, you want to be on mute. You don't want, that chance where, something's going to happen. The dog barks. and you're not speaking, but all of a sudden everybody heard your dog bark. So again, you want to be really thorough. There are so many things to consider with the technology and your setup, but you know, these are hopefully some things that will get you at least clued into not overlooking any one of them. And finally, you know, if appropriate, have your own staff. You know, have your own person that's going to be that moderator to field the questions. Have that person that's going to be just off to the side, able to answer any particular questions that come in that are related to the technology. Maybe somebody can't hear you or something like that. So these are all things that play into that overall technology setup, but that really just include the, you know, the background, the environment as a whole. And I'm going to turn it over to Tim now, because I know he knows a lot about Plan B.
Unfortunately, most of my Plan B knowledge comes from things going wrong in interviews. If you looked at I remember my first interview that went wrong. This was back in the day where we had, I feel like I'm saying back in the day too much today, where we had halogen bulbs that were running our projectors instead of LED bulbs, which burnt out every 18 hours, or at least every couple of presentations. And so I actually had a bulb burn out on me during a presentation. That was the first time things went wrong. They've gone wrong many times since then. So when we're in a virtual interview, we've got to do the same thing. Now, for years, you guys have probably all brought in printed copies of your slides into an interview room. You can probably guess that's kind of out the window here. Interesting enough, in virtual, there's no such thing as Plan B. And it's a little bit different than what you might think. There's no such thing as Plan B, because in virtual, there's Plan B, there's Plan C, and there's Plan D. And the only way you can really succeed at Plan B is by having Plan B, Plan C, and Plan D. So I'm going to walk you through Plan A, B, C, and D, and then kind of give you some extra items as well. So first off, Plan A, all goes to plan, you're good to go. Plan B is having one of these things at the ready. And the reason you have one of these at the ready is a little bit different than what you're thinking. Hey, New York City. One of the things that you have this at the ready for is so that you can turn on your hotspot immediately. So when you're giving a presentation like this, my power goes out, my internet goes down. My immediate motion is not to go try and figure out how to get my internet back on. My immediate motion is to swipe down and turn on my hotspot on my phone, and I'm immediately back in. Even if I have to log out and log back in, it's probably only going to be about 30 seconds of downtime to switch over to that hotspot. We don't want to run off the hotspot, obviously. Sylvia, you said you were wired in before. That's why this is Plan B, because it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's not perfect. Second thing is making certain that that you have Zoom, WebEx, Teams, whatever you're using on your cell phone as an app. Now, the first step is it went down and I switched over my internet access. The second thing is something goes wrong with my computer and I switch over to a Zoom meeting right here. So if we go down right now, I kick over to a Zoom webinar as a presenter on my cell phone. Is it ideal? No, that's why we call it Plan C. But it gets you to keep the interview going, which is so important. You don't want that interview to die. The last thing, Plan D, which is the one I really hope you never get to, is it's the dial-in number. You can dial into these meetings. You're going to lose your presentation, some of those things, but making certain that you have that dial-in number very, very, very ready so that you can jump in immediately if that need arises. Now, I promised you a little bit more than just those three things, which are Plan B, Plan C, and Plan D. But here's a couple of other notes, and then I'll wrap up with this, which is, first off is multiple hosts. If you especially are on WebEx, they're known for this, which is when the host goes down, everybody goes down. So you always make certain that we have multiple hosts. Sarah, you're a host today. I'm a host as well. And that's so that we have redundancy. Sarah's in Charlotte, North Carolina today. If Charlotte goes down and I'm sitting in Richmond or Sylvia's up in Washington, D.C., all of a sudden we've got those places covered no matter what happens outside of us. Second thing is, client phone numbers. Always make certain that someone has the phone numbers to each of your clients so you can reach out to them and get them very rapidly back into the interview or to help them navigate any problems they have. Slides at the ready just means this, is that we're sitting here, and if you drop out and you dial in, the client, we're going to send you a quick email that has those slides so you can stay just as engaged as you were before. You're going to have to change your presentation. You're going to have to tell them where you are, but that's okay. We've got the interview still running. And finally, and most importantly, you need a Sarah. The Sarah is the person and is the key to running Plan B and to making certain that all of these things are moving forward.
You know, I'm a big fan of subliminal messages, and what I loved about your Plan B portion is that it also sends a very strong and powerful message to that prospect you're speaking with. You know what it sends? It sends a message of this team that is presenting to you has anticipated every possible scenario, and we are ready for those scenarios. And as a client, that gives me comfort, and I definitely want to work with a firm that anticipates all of the potential issues that we may run into and has made accommodations for all of them. So if nothing else, Plan B, you know, when put in action, unfortunately, is going to send that subliminal message. And what's better than ending on a positive message? You know, if you don't have that Plan B, you know, even the greatest presentation would still end in somewhat of a negative message. So to me, that's, you know, the most awesome subliminal message that you can be sending with a Plan B.
Awesome. That's been some great information, y'all. We really appreciate it. We got a lot of questions for you coming in the hopper here. A lot of them asking about the teleprompter tool. Can you give them a little bit of suggestions on which ones to use?
I don't have the name of it directly in front of me right now. We can happily send that out. If you want to send the note over to Sylvia, that's great. Whose email address is up on the screen. But yes, that really is a great tool. And again, the key is cheat. You're using technology. Technology will give you a cheat. Let's take advantage of it.
Awesome. Now I noticed you, Sylvia, you and Tim are not on the screen at the same time when you're speaking. Is this on purpose? Is it intentional? Is it what was the purpose behind that?
Exactly. So if you look in your settings, you can set it up so that the person speaking is the one that is showcased. And we wanted that. That was intentional for our presentation. Of course, every presentation is going to vary different, but you want to look into your settings for that.
Okay. Touching back on building rapport, what if their backgrounds are blurred, or if they have just a general corporate background? What else can you do to possibly develop a relationship prior to, if you can't research them prior, or don't see anything in their background?
Yeah, I'm feeling sorry for the people that didn't jump on early here, because we had quite the dialogue going on. You know, one of the things that we talked about earlier on was these cars all sitting behind me on the shelf. Yep. I was telling Sylvia a story about the cars and about how every year for Christmas, my kids ask me what I want for Christmas, and every single year I ask them for a Porsche, and without fail, I get a Porsche. And I've been getting these for 10 years now, so I have a shelf full of them. And then we started talking about bourbon earlier on, and we couldn't see any of you, yet the comments filled up with people wanting to talk about these things. So the best thing we can do to open up our conversations, if we don't have those cues from our clients, is to tell stories about ourselves. A phrase I've used in the past, those of you that have been through one of my other one of my other seminars, or who've read some of the stuff I've written, is a picture is worth 1,000 words. We all know that. And a story paints a picture. So if you're looking to connect with somebody and you're looking for 1,000 different ways to connect with them, the key is to make certain you paint a picture with your words, which is a story.
And, you know, and this goes to the preparation. Again, your practice. There's nothing wrong with having come up with, 2 or 3 things that you guys are going to banter about, in the absence of there being nothing else that, becomes obvious. So again, it's all about, you can cheat, you can have some notes that you can kind of glance to, and you can also have those things, just parked to the side that you're going to use. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Tim, I know you, just because from the behind the scenes, I know you were running the entire presentation as far as pulling slides up. Do you recommend one person being responsible for bringing in and turning off slides, or having it shared? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I definitely do recommend that one person is driving that. You can do multiple. You know, the exception I would say to that would be if you were pulling up a set of architectural renderings or plans and you wanted to walk through those, and you wanted the designer to do that. Sometimes having the mouse to be able to control that is really, really, really helpful. But outside of a context like that, no, I think that one person being centrally responsible. But remember, we're on Plan B, C, D. Sarah, you have a copy of the deck in your desktop. Sylvia, you have a copy on your desktop. Honestly, any of us could have jumped in and kept the presentation going and making certain we were ready for that.
Exactly.
Well, Sylvia, I know you had touched on the ask portion at the end. What are some of the best asks for a job that you've heard over the years? I know that a lot of times some people don't feel comfortable doing that.
You know, I've heard a lot of them. And my personal recommendation and philosophy is, well, first of all, if you don't feel comfortable making an ask, then you're not comfortable for this project. Simple as that. So if you're really passionate, if you're really committed, you know, it will be easy for you and it will come natural for you to say, you know, this is a project we're really excited about. They will have seen that already through your presentation. So it's not like you're making it up. And just be straightforward. You know, we really want this project. We're really looking forward to you. We can do a great job. And that's the best that you can ask for.
Okay, here's one for the both of you. This one came in and it said, I work with a lot of engineers and most firms have the same story. How do you make them unique and not boring in the presentation?
Wow, that goes back to your strategy and your differentiation, and we could do a whole other seminar on that.
Yeah.
But, you know, in a case like this, you know, hopefully you have those things already, because if you don't have them, you're not going to be able to just make them in a presentation like this. But, you know, honesty. You know, every firm, and I always said this to my clients, every firm has something unique about what they do and how they do it. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the firm, it's about the people that work in that firm. So there is just something inherently differentiated about what they do. And hopefully you've done the homework ahead of time to, you know, figure that out. But that's the goal through the presentation. And maybe in the absence of having anything, the very least you can do is show your excitement and show how much you really, really want this project. Tim, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, at Timmons Group, we refer to it as the 10%. Because the reality is 90% of what one engineering firm does or can do is similar to what another engineering firm does or can do. But it's that 10% that's on top that you can really differentiate from. I know you're waiting till the end on this one, but Sylvia, I would suggest what's up on the screen right now. You talk about that real quick, just because I think that's what's going to set people apart in something like this.
Exactly. And, you know, this is for participants only, but, you know, sometimes it's just handy to have a third party kind of look at what you're doing or kind of help you develop a customized approach for presenting, you know, for practicing and getting ready for a virtual shortlist presentation. So if any of you guys out there, you think your firms might be interested in this, you know, just shoot me an email and we can talk about ways that Timmons Group could be able to help you. And I think with that, we're on our time. So, you know, hopefully you guys have picked up some, you know, cool new tricks, some tips, some good reminders, and this is beneficial to all of you. And we really appreciate the time you've taken to be with us this afternoon. Thank you.
I couldn't add anything else to that, Sylvia. Thank you, everybody. I know we have so many friends on the line right now, and it is great to, in the middle of all that's going on, at least be able to have a little bit of interaction with all of you. Some of you old friends from other markets and places all across the United States. You know, when we're sitting here and we, you know, top 400 or 500 on a interview or on this discussion, it's awesome. As a reminder to everybody, this event sold out because we could only hit 500 people in the webinar, and there is another webinar coming up. Sarah, I'm not sure if you had that covered.
Yes, excuse me. We will be hosting this again next Thursday, and you can register online at our website at www.timmons.com. Registration is still open and ready for participants.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.